issue to understand. But let me give you a little bit of background, just a framework. In the 1990s, the leaders of the abortion movement realized that what had been a problem was now becoming a crisis for them. And that was, they may have been winning on getting Roe versus Wade and getting legislators into office and having the courts on their side, but their real problem was there weren't enough doctors willing to do abortions. And doctors are not willing to do it because so many doctors understand abortion is the killing of a human being. At the same time, the right to die movement was gaining some traction, and they also had a bit of a problem. They had a PR problem. They had, the Dr. Kevorkians who didn't make it look very appealing. And so these two movements, kind of separate from each other, but they came to the same conclusions, the realization that they needed to normalize death. They needed to make it part of the medical community, accepted within the medical community, make it a part of the mainstream practice of medicine, both killing at the beginning of life and at the end of life. And so they worked very hard to sanitize and professionalize both abortion and end of life with what they would call treatment. And they also wanted to take the concepts from being a choice, you have a choice to do this, to being the right choice, it's the best choice, and then being the only choice, especially if you were a healthcare provider. And so there's been tremendous pressure put on doctors to do abortions and to refer for abortions, to the point where doctors are now being threatened with whether they even have the right of conscience, whether they have the choice not to. The same type of thing's been happening at the end-of-life issue, but a real pressure there. Not only has end-of-life treatment, I guess you'd call it, been rather normalized, but the conscience pressure is really on the patient and the patient's family, that this is the best thing, is to end someone's life who would be a burden. So our next session is going to be dealing with these issues of the pressures within the medical and healthcare community on the doctors and the patients. So our first speaker, Dr. Donna Harrison, is with the American Association of Pro-Life OB-GYNs, and she's been working on the defending life from within the medical community for decades. She and I met when we worked together to challenge the Food and Drug Administration's approval of RU46, the abortion pill. And she has delved into the medical literature and what the other side is saying in order to normalize abortion. And she and I have been to abortion conferences. We go to where they are talking amongst themselves to take notes and find out what is their strategy. She knows inside and out what's happening on the pressures being put on the medical community. And our second speaker will be Pastor Scott Bailey, who's going to deal with the end of life. He's a hospital chaplain. So he's the one who's walking alongside the families and the patients who are dealing with those, right at those last decisions of life, and helping them to make decisions that are honoring to God. So would you please, the way we're going to work this is we'll have Donna Harrison will come and speak first, and then we'll take her questions for her, and then we'll have Pastor Bailey, he'll speak, and we'll take the questions from you all for him. So would you please welcome Donna Harrison.
I'm going to make sure I know how to use this first. Okay, here we go. I love art because I think that sometimes art conveys things in a very efficient way that words don't quite always capture. How many of you know what this picture is of? This is Hippocrates. And if you'll notice, Hippocrates and his barefoot disciples are saying, no, I don't want it. And they're saying, no, I don't want money. I don't want gold. I don't want the scepter of ruling. Because he started something that was different in the medical profession. In Hippocrates' day, physicians were for hire. If you paid them enough money, they'd kill your neighbor. If you paid them enough money, they'd heal your disease. That's just, they were technologists, and you just hired them for what you wanted. And he said, no, there's something different about the medical profession. So he and his followers practiced according to a certain oath that they took. And there are essential elements of this oath that I want you to be familiar with so you understand what Hippocrates did in his time and what we need to recapture in our time. One, to teach medicine only to those who are bound by this oath. It isn't an issue of teaching it to my colleagues or my buddies. It was only those people who were willing to adhere to this oath, to act only for the benefit of the patient, to never assist in suicide or practice euthanasia, nor even suggest it, to never perform an abortion, to refer to patients of sufficient expertise. I, as an OB-GYN, I'm not going to take out a kidney stone. I'm not going to do it. To never have sex with patients, even though you could, because the patient-physician relationship is one of power and vulnerability. To maintain patient confidentiality. And the last, which is very interesting, is the invocation of the transcendent blessing or curse. I take this oath in the face of the transcendent to say, if I violate this oath, I'm violating an oath that I took between me and God. The important thing about the Hippocratic Oath is that it went from a minority opinion in 400 BC, this predates Christianity, to form the worldwide foundation of medical ethics for the next 2,000 years, for both Christian, Jewish, and Islamic medicine. The oath defined a unique doctor-patient relationship. There is no doctor-patient relationship without the oath. That is what makes it unique in all of the other kinds of professions, because it's characterized by a physician's sacred vow never to do harm. Your lawyer does not take the same oath, neither does your accountant. The oath actually forms the basis of a physician's conscience. I want to read you this quote. An increasing number of healthcare professionals are claiming the right to abandon their patients, particularly those who have to make reproductive choices in the name of conscience. I want you to focus in on a couple of things that I'm going to underline in these next series of quotes. The well-being of patients should be the first priority of both medicine and public health care policy. Focus in on that issue of well-being. It's the responsibility of the healthcare profession, the healthcare system, to ensure that patients are fully informed about all their legally available medical options and that they receive referrals if an individual clinician opts out of providing a specific service. Does this sound like it's legally written? Yes. Alta Charo, law professor, University of Wisconsin. She is not a clinician, but she is well versed in what it takes to destroy the right of conscience. These words delineate the crux of the debate over conscientious objection, and if you understand these words, you'll understand both the legal argument that's being made and the defense that's being made. Conscience, duty, well-being, and health. So I want to look at some of these definitions so that we're familiar with them. Conscience, it's the awareness of a moral or ethical aspect to one's conduct, together with an urge to prefer right over wrong. Now, I want to compare this with what my professional society, the American College of OB-GYNs, defines conscience as, which is a personal sentiment or a personal problem. Duty. Duty is a technical term of law, and it signifies the thing due, that which is due from a person, that which a person owes to another. In the use of duty, there's a correspondence between right and duty. If John has a right, then his right corresponds to my duty. If I have a duty, it corresponds to somebody else's right. So right and duty are legally circumferential words. Well-being and health, these are critically important terms to get a handle on. Well-being is defined as a good or satisfactory condition of existence, a state characterized by health, happiness, and prosperity. There's a Greek term called eudaimonia. Eudaimonia is a contented state of being happy, healthy, and prosperous. And why do I bring up eudaimonia? Because we are in the midst of a 3,000-year-old argument right now, and our culture is in the crux of that argument. And both of these terms, well-being and eudaimonia, have as their core this idea of health. Well, what is health? Health is a condition of being sound in body, mind, or spirit, especially freedom from physical disease or pain. It's also flourishing, well-being. So well-being is health, health is well-being. But the WHO in 1948 put forth this worldwide definition of health, a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. 1948. This is a current definition, a relative state in which one is able to function well physically, mentally, socially, and spiritually in order to express the full range of one's unique potentialities within the environment in which one is living. In the words of René Dubois, health is primarily a measure of each person's ability to do and become whatever he wants to become. What's not included? This definition of health, this expansive definition, was applied in Doe versus Bolton. You guys all know about Roe versus Wade, the trimester system, legalized abortion, except where it affects a woman's health. Okay. Doe versus Bolton was issued the same day and defined health legally. Health is, this is the wording of it. We agree with the district court that the medical judgment may be exercised in the light of all factors, physical, emotional, psychological, familial, and the woman's age, relevant to well-being of the patient. All these factors relate to health, which means that everything relates to health, which means that there is no, that there's an exception for every law, and that's the health exception. So I just thought I'd pull out on an individual level what psychological health looks like, and these are all the factors you have to take into account. Okay. So what's the crux of the conflict? The conflict is what happens when what I want to do and become, my health, requires someone else to perform an action which they consider to be evil. So to put it in another way, the expansive hedonic definition of health runs headlong into the large body of jurisprudence defending the eudaimonic right of the individual to act in accordance with their conscience. And this right to act in accordance with your conscience is the very foundation of what made America different than every other country of the world. I mean, we were here for religious freedom, that is, acting according to our conscience. So I want to take you on a 3,000-year-old journey for a second here. Eudaimonia is a concept of virtue ethics. And what it says is that actualizing the nature of a human being is what results in well-being. So happiness is a byproduct of right action for the right reason. So doing the right thing according to virtue and reason is what makes a person have well-being or human flourishing. Versus the only other alternative, only other significant alternative with a lot of body of philosophical work behind it, teleological ethics, consequentialism, which says morality is contingent on the outcome. The end justifies the means, and it's utilitarian as a subset. Happiness and pleasure is well-being. It's not a byproduct of well-being. Well-being is happiness and pleasure. Why does it matter? Well, from the ancient world through the Middle Ages, a good man was one who fulfilled his duties to his family and his church and society and fulfilled his as a sacred duty to God. But in a utilitarian, hedonistic worldview, since God doesn't exist, a good man is one who is free from all social constraints, think Rousseau, and one who has no relational obligations to family, church, or society. The only obligation is to the state, and the ultimate good is maximizing happiness and pleasure. Okay, that's where we're at. Which one of the two worldviews, the underlying assumptions, do you follow? And that explains why in many of these conversations we're doing this, because our view of well-being and happiness and purpose and health are completely skewed. They don't even intersect in many cases. So from the ancient world through the Middle Ages, a good physician acted to protect and save the life and functioning of his patient and to relieve pain as a sacred duty to God. Versus a hedonistic utilitarian worldview, in a patient-controlled utilitarian worldview, a good physician is one who does what the patient wants and gives them what they want. In a state-controlled system, a good physician is one who maximizes the goals of the state. So in a patient-controlled utilitarian system, the purpose of medicine shifts away from promoting the absence of disease and shifts toward prescribing drugs, performing abortions, because that's what the patient wants for their own health. And they define what health is because it's ultimately becoming whatever I want to become. And in a state-controlled system, we get into the aspects of allocating health care. Because, of course, for the good of the people, we have to eliminate these huge costs at the end of life. So we've been here before. This experiment's been done before in history. This poster is from Nazi Germany, and it says, and I'll probably not pronounce the German correctly, so I won't even try. It says, folks, my friends, fellow citizens, this is also your gold, okay? This is how much money it takes to care for a crippled person, okay? And this quote is from a book, if you've never read it, you really must read it. It's called The Nazi Doctors. It's by Robert J. Lifton. He's a psychiatrist, a Jewish psychiatrist, who was very bothered by the Holocaust. He couldn't figure it out. So he went back and he interviewed all the physicians who survived the Nuremberg trials. And what he found was that these were the best and the brightest. And what made them Nazi physicians was the patient became the state. It was not the person they were dealing with, it was the state. So they were treating the state, and you know sometimes how in cancer you have to cut out certain things in order for the patient to live? Well, the cancer that was being cut out was the crippled people and the Jews and the gypsies and those people who were enemies of the state. So they were servants of the state. That was the altruistic good motive that these physicians had. And he said what was, at the end of the book, he says, what was so disturbing about this is I expected people with fangs and horns, and what I got were people that were attractive and brilliant and seeking after good. And he said, and that is evil. And he said, and it's so attractive. So it's something we have to grapple with, because what we have today in this country is brilliant, beautiful, intelligent people who are doing things which are plain out, flat out evil if you think that there is a God and there is good. Whoa, come on. Oh, there we go. Okay. Just as an example, here's Ezekiel Emanuel. Services provided to individuals who are irreversibly prevented from being or becoming participating citizens are not basic and should not be guaranteed. An obvious example is not guaranteeing health services to patients with dementia. This is not a foreign concept, guys. Okay. So we come to the war on Hippocratic conscience, which is raging right now in the medical profession. This is the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology, who purport to speak for 56,000 OB-GYNs across the country. They do not speak for APLOG. And they actually, about 85% of OB-GYNs they don't speak for. What they said in their limits of conscientious refusal is healthcare providers occasionally may find that providing indicated, even standard care would present for them a personal moral problem, not an issue of conscience, a conflict of conscience. That's how they define it, particularly in reproductive medicine. So conscientious refusals, not conscientious objection, that conflict with patient well-being, remember the expansive definition of health, should be accommodated only if the duty to the patient, that is, she wants an abortion, can be fulfilled. And they go on to say, I don't think I got this quote in here. Yeah, okay. In an emergency in which referral is not possible or might negatively have an impact on a patient's physical or mental health, that is, she has to wait or go to somebody else, providers have an obligation to provide medically indicated and requested care. And then they have the hubris to go on and say, if you don't provide abortions, you need to pick up your practice and locate it next to somebody who does. I mean, this is an amazing statement from a professional organization. This is another different document that they put out, Committee Opinion 613, I believe. The American College of OB-GYNs supports the availability of high-quality reproductive health services for all women and is neutral, committed to improving access to abortion. Okay. Calls for advocacy to oppose and overturn restrictions, improve access, and mainstream abortion as an integral component of women's health. 85% of OB-GYNs across this country do not perform abortions in their private practice. It's been shown by 2 studies recently within the last 5 years. And this organization purports to speak for 56,000 OB-GYNs across the country. They interchange leadership with Planned Parenthood Federation of America. This is another document published in a leading medical journal. Conscientious objection should be dealt with like any other failure to perform one's professional duty. again, the legal word duty, through enforcement and disciplinary action. And in fact, counteracting institutional conscientious objection, i.e. the Roman Catholic Church or any health-based, religiously based, faith-based healthcare organization, may require governmental or international intervention. We're going to bring the law down on your head. This is Altacharo, the quote I started with, the law professor from University of Wisconsin. An increasing number of healthcare professionals are claiming the right to abandon their patients, particularly those who have to make reproductive choices in the name of conscience. The well-being of patients, this expansive definition of health, should be the first priority of both medicine and public health policy. Charo argues that state licensing of physicians requires physicians to act as an agent of the state. This is what she says. In granting physicians a monopoly on the provision of health care, they turn the profession into a kind of public utility, obligated to provide service to all who seek it. Okay, which brings me to Stormans versus Wiseman. This is the Washington right of conscience case where a family-owned pharmacy business, it's escaping me the name of the business, you'd recognize it, was told by the state of Washington, you will have on your shelf Ella, or you will not have a state of Washington license to practice pharmacy. Because, as the state said, we provide state licensure and you are a utility. That was the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals decision. So that went to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, this is what the Ninth Circuit said. The Ninth Circuit said, a pharmacy may not refer a patient to another pharmacy to avoid filling a prescription, but only for Ella. You can refer to another pharmacy to avoid filling a prescription because it's too expensive for you to stock, or because you couldn't get it in for another reason, or because you don't like the product, but not Ella. Okay? Cannot refer a patient to another pharmacy because a pharmacy has a duty to deliver lawfully prescribed medications in a timely manner. This is a ridiculous decision. Pharmacies do not prescribe chemotherapy. That's a lawful medicine. Pharmacies do not prescribe or do not have a whole variety of drugs that are only limited to certain special circumstances. There is no reason for this other than to establish that healthcare is a utility. And unfortunately, that ruling was upheld by the Supreme Court. Non-discrimination in healthcare programs and activities. This is a statement that was issued in July of 2016, just this past year, by the Office of Civil Rights, which is under HHS. And they said, the OCR, Office of Civil Rights, determines what discrimination on the basis of sex means. This clarified this term. And impermissible discrimination included gender identity, sex stereotyping, and termination of pregnancy. That's all sex discrimination. Who must comply? Every entity which receives federal funding. If I, as a physician, have one Medicaid patient, I receive federal funding, I must comply. What if you don't comply? The patient has a private right of action. Remember that statement, because I'll come back to it. This is the chairman of this independent committee, this OCR. He says, the phrase religious liberty and religious freedom will stand for nothing except hypocrisy, so long as they remain code words for discrimination, intolerance, racism, sexism, homophobia, Islamophobia, Christian supremacy, or any other form of intolerance. This is the chairman of the Office of Civil Rights. Okay. Wendy referred to some pro-abortion conferences that we went to. I'm going to specifically mention one we went to in 2007. It was called the Women Deliver Conference. And at that time, I should have recorded it, I didn't. I was in a breakout session that talked about 4 obstacles to implementation of abortion worldwide. The number one obstacle was conscientious objection by healthcare workers. The second obstacle was the presence of the Roman Catholic Church in the healthcare system in Latin America and the presence of Protestant missionaries in the healthcare system in Africa. The third was ultrasound, which unfortunately turns the mind of the pregnant woman to the humanity of her fetus. And the fourth was the people don't want it, but we're going to work within the legal system and we're going to give it to them anyway. So this is a very well orchestrated effort to push for radical, to push for abortion legalization worldwide, but also this expansive hedonic view of healthcare. This happened just a couple weeks ago. The Committee on Social Affairs in the French Senate amended the bill of law instituting a new crime called obstruction to abortion. If you stand outside a clinic and you obstruct in any way or cause the woman any kind of distress, you are guilty of the crime of obstruction to abortion. This just happened. Little Sisters of the Poor, you've all heard of it. The challenges to the Affordable Care Act. They were all based on this something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. It was very interesting. The government in the lower court argued that the Little Sisters didn't even have a case because the government is going to deliver contraceptive services without using the Little Sisters plan, and that there was no way to deliver these services except for what the government outlined in the mandate. But before the Supreme Court, they said that the current scheme was impossible without the Little Sisters' cooperation, and that the government did have other ways to deliver the services without using the Little Sisters. So the design of this Affordable Care Act was actually designed to eliminate conscientious objection, institutional conscientious objection. And what was decided in that case was actually that the case was put back down to the decision of the lower court, but the government said, okay, you and the Little Sisters work out a way to deliver this without the Affordable Care Act. So it wasn't exactly a victory. It was more like, we're not going to decide in your favor, in the administration's favor. So what do we have to defend our conscience right now? Well, we have this document called the First Amendment to the Constitution, like Bill of Rights. We have the Church Amendment in '73, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, which the Affordable Care Act challenges were based on. And we have the Public Health Service Act, and we have the Hyde-Weldon Amendment. And none of them have a private right of action. None of them. So let me introduce you to Kathy DiCarlo, who's speaking right there, at the introduction of the Conscience Protection Act this past year, which was passed by the House but not picked up by the Senate. Kathy DiCarlo, a nurse at Mount Sinai Hospital, been there for years, Filipino Catholic, was pulled from her surgical job because they didn't have enough nurses on the abortion wing. She said, I'm not going to do it. They said, you'll lose your job. She said, I'm not going to do it. They said, we'll pull your state medical license. She's a single mom, supports her family. She went in, assisted in a 21-week abortion, was very traumatic. You know, what do you do in that case? You got a family to support. So she sued Sinai Hospital, and it was thrown out of court because Kathy DiCarlo doesn't have a private right of action. Only HHS could sue on Kathy's behalf. And do you think the Obama HHS sued on Kathy's behalf? No. Okay. So we have a short window of time. We have to establish conscientious objection in healthcare in American law within the next couple years. That's all we got. Pass the Conscience Protection Act. Whoever you can talk to pass the Conscience Protection Act. It's being reintroduced right now. It was introduced in the House, but it wasn't introduced in the Senate because they were waiting to see the outcome of the election. We now know the outcome of the election. We've got to get this passed in the House and Senate and signed into law, because that is the only way that we as healthcare providers have any legal ground to stand on. We don't have our American College of OB-GYN behind us. We don't have the American Medical Society behind us. We have to have a legal right to be able to say, I will not take the life of another human being because it violates my oath that I've taken, the Hippocratic Oath. And you got to get involved. We got to get involved. We got to get our churches involved. We have to speak out. This is not just healthcare providers. The Religious Freedom Restoration Act is about you pastors, guys. If the healthcare providers lose it, you are not going to have a legal leg to stand on. And so I'll leave you with Hippocrates and his choice. Thank you.
For Dr. Anderson.
What parallels do you see between, say, the fight for the right of conscientious objection to military service in the draft and what the conscientious objection to refuse to participate in abortions? I would think that is something that you might be able to make common cause with,
Right.
like the ACLU even.
Right. Well, you're right. And we've looked at that. It turns out that only anti-discrimination is a body of jurisprudence big enough to tramp on conscientious objection. So conscientious objection to taking a human life in war was actually based on religious freedom. Okay, so it all does go back to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act. But yes, it is an argument. It is kind of astounding that people who would object to military service, compulsory military service, are the very same people who are forcing physicians to kill their patients. It's very ironic. Yeah.
When I graduated from medical school right after the Ark landed,
Me too.
yeah, we took the Hippocratic Oath,
Yeah.
the original Hippocratic Oath.
Yep.
I went back as a emeritus type to the latest graduation, and they still have the Hippocratic Oath, but it's rewritten,
Yeah.
and it has nothing in it about not taking a life by abortion. And many medical schools don't even give it lip service. They have no Hippocratic Oath to recite. How are you going to deal with the medical schools who are grinding out positions
Right.
that are being taught to be compliant with our modern society?
Well, I can tell you that APLOG has a vision, and I know Catholic Medical Association is already implementing this vision to restart Hippocratic medical banquets, where students who are graduating come among their peers in the church and say, we will take this oath in the presence of God. And so it becomes a faithful peer issue. We're not going to be able to do it on an institutional level because the institutions are utilitarian. They're committedly utilitarian. So it's going to have to take the church to stand up and say, you know what? Let's hold in our community a Hippocratic medical banquet. Let's get some speakers. I can give you 10 speakers all across the country, guys, if you want to do this. And get together and let's get the physicians in our church to encourage the students to take this oath in our presence, and we will be your peers. We'll be your Hippocrates peers. But we've got to do it. It's got to happen within the church. It can't happen within the institutions. They're gone. Yeah. Go ahead. The Conscience Protection Act. I don't know what number it's going to have, so I can't give you HR, blah, blah, blah. But I know it's being reintroduced. And so it's CPA, Conscience Protection Act. Yeah, there was somebody over here.
You have a quick question?
I'll be quick. I was just wondering if, I hear a lot that, these are poor people, that we do abortions, that we can't care for them. All the time in front of clinics, that's the reason parents get, why would I bring someone into school? I'm wondering if, on a medical level, is the argument being explicitly made that we're servants of the state by ridding society of people that they otherwise would have to care for? Is that being made explicitly?
Only if you're Ruth Bader Ginsburg and you happen to slip in front of the camera. No, abortion stands on 4 legs. The first one is it's a blob of tissue. The second one is it's good for women. Our organization, APLOG, chews on that leg. The third one is we want to get rid of those people that are costing society more. Look up the Gruber, the abortion, the cost of abortion, or what abortion has saved society. It's grotesque. And then the fourth leg, though, is the one the church has to work on that Roland Stevens was talking about, and that is the walk away. If he can walk away, I can walk away. So, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I'm sure that felt like you were drinking from a fire hose. That was a ton of information. But I really recommend you to Dr. Harrison and her organization, American Association of Pro-Life OB-GYNs, AAPLOG. You can find more on their website. She'll also be around for the rest of the day if you have more questions. Well, you see the pressure now being put on the medical community to accept death as a acceptable form of treatment. And now we're going to switch a little bit to what it's like for patients as we're facing the end of life. And I'm so pleased that Pastor Scott Bailey's with us. I just met him a couple of months ago and was so touched by his ministry as a chaplain. And he'll talk with us today about our rights and responsibilities, our duties as patients. We actually do have rights as patients, and we need to know what they are. So please welcome Pastor Scott Bailey.
Thank you and good afternoon. Everybody awake from lunch? Good afternoon. I don't have a PowerPoint. I would call myself technologically challenged. My wife would probably say I'm technologically disabled. But I do want to talk today about end-of-life issues, and specifically we'll be talking about advanced directives. This grows out of a presentation that was much more expansive that I did for the Diocese of the Mid-Atlantic back in September. So we'll talk about advanced directives and then other issues as time allows. During the Q&A, if you have questions beyond advanced directives related to hospice and palliative care, nutrition and hydration, organ donation, I despise the term, but persistent vegetative state and all those sorts of things, please feel free, if this stirs thoughts in your mind, to ask those questions as well. I draw a lot of my materials from Anglicans for Life, who have a wonderful website with tremendous resources. Also, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, who have a lot of wonderful resources on their website as well. And finally, the Patients' Rights Council, who we'll come back to talking about in a little while. They're based in Steubenville, Ohio. I want to begin with a scripture from Isaiah chapter 46, verses 3 through 4. Because this really frames our entire conversation today. Listen to me, O house of Jacob, all the remnant of the house of Israel, who have been born by me from before your birth, carried from the womb, even to your old age, I am he, and to gray hairs I will carry you. I have made, and I will bear, I will carry, and will save. Our worth and value as human beings is assigned to us by God because he created us in his image, both male and female. And as we all know, human life, the value of that life extends from the moment of conception until natural death. One of the challenges as we talk about end-of-life issues is that definition of natural death is a moving target. And frankly, what was natural death 100 years ago is not the same as what natural death is today because of wonderful but also very complex advances in medical technology that are very confusing to a lot of people. And as we talk about pro-life issues, as has already been affirmed today, both with the unborn and throughout the life spectrum to end-of-life issues, I think as a pastor and a chaplain, and for all of us, what we need to do is inculcate in the people we serve and the people we interact with, not an issues-driven approach, but a pro-life worldview. And then out of that worldview, that biblically based, God-ordained worldview that is comprehensive, we speak to specific issues in light of God's word and in light of who we are as God's people. We need to address issues, absolutely, from a biblical and moral perspective, and we need to be continually educating ourselves. End-of-life issues are confusing. People are looking for guidance. If you're a pastoral caregiver, whether that means you're clergy or you're a layperson in your church, people are looking for guidance, and they often, with right motives, end up looking to the wrong places for that guidance. I don't consider myself an expert. I'm not a clinician. I'm not an ethicist, and I'm certainly not an attorney. But I do want to speak from experience and some things that I've seen and observed both in the hospital and in my own family. These issues are issues that we cannot avoid in this day. And people are uncomfortable talking about end-of-life issues. Does everyone agree with that? It's a very uncomfortable, even for wonderful Christian people, it can be very uncomfortable, especially when you start talking about end-of-life issues that pertain to them or pertain to me, or we start branching into that realm that is deeply personal. And yet we have to talk about these things, because if we don't, we're going to be thrust into a system that will make decisions for us, very often against our own conscience and our own values. The U.S. population is aging. Currently, 40 million people in the United States are over the age of 65. 5.5 million people are over the age of 85. Senior citizens are the fastest growing demographic in the United States. They're the fastest growing mission field in the United States. Think about it that way, if they're the fastest growing demographic. And in the midst of all that is going on, we hear issues and terms tossed around such as being kept alive by machines. Again, I despise this term, but it's one that's used. Being a vegetable. No human being will ever be a vegetable. Assisted suicide, death with dignity. So what I want to do is talk about advanced directives in a way that frames them so that we can age well and that we can die with dignity and grace in a way that honors Christ and affirms the gospel that we believe. As we do this, I also want to comment, it's important, as much as is reasonably possible, to not develop an adversarial relationship with medical care providers and physicians. That being said, we also need to go into these processes with our eyes wide open and fully understanding that there are people with agendas in the medical field, clinicians and other professionals, and their agendas, it doesn't even have to be an agenda all of the time, but sometimes their worldview is very different than ours, so the way they frame things, the way things are presented, is not in a way that affirms what we value and what we believe as Christians. So I want to talk about advanced directives, which is a broad term, and it can be defined as this. An advanced directive is a written statement regarding medical treatment which is made to ensure that those wishes are carried out should the person be unable to speak for himself or herself. There are three types of advanced directives I'm going to speak to briefly today. The idea here is this, though, that in making advanced directives, in developing advanced directives, the key is that medical decision-making is retained by me as the patient, or if I cannot make those decisions for myself, that decision-making is placed in the hands of those who know me well and who I trust will make decisions in accord with my values and my worldview. The first and most familiar type of advanced directive is what we call a living will. Folks familiar with a living will? The goal of a living will, and living wills became very prevalent, especially in the 1980s after the whole Karen, if you're old enough to remember this, I was just a wee little lad, the whole Karen Ann Quinlan situation where she was on extended life support in a deep coma, and after she was taken off of life support, she still lived for a number of years beyond that, despite what they thought was going to happen. Some of you folks remember that back in the late 70s. I believe that issue was around 1978. But a living will states a person's wishes regarding treatment options, and it is activated in the future should that person not be able to make those decisions for himself or herself. What is the problem with living wills? Well, there are two problems, I think, first of all. The first problem is this. Living wills tend to oversimplify complex issues that are growing more complex every day, because in a living will, and I have several of them with me in my folder here today, different formats, things are framed as, if this is the situation, I want this, I don't want this, or if my doctor says, then he or she should make that decision. That's basically how things are framed in a living will. So it creates all kinds of issues in terms of subjective judgments on the part of the medical caregiver, and control of medical decisions, if you can't speak for yourself, are placed into the hands of others. And that's the second problem. A living will gives authority to a physician or medical care provider over a family if the patient cannot speak for him, herself, or herself, and that medical decision authority is binding. Again, we're often dealing with oversimplifications of complex issues, especially around things like nutrition and hydration, the level of a person's responsiveness and brain activity, and all of that range of things. The other thing that we run up against, and I know this with my own parents, who are wonderful people and still live independently, but my dad is 85 and my mom is 81, and they are still very much of the old school mindset that their family doctor is the one who helps them make their medical decisions. And the reality is, in the current healthcare climate and the current healthcare world in the United States, if you're admitted to the hospital, your family physician, your primary care provider, is pretty much out of the picture in terms of your medical care. You are in the care of a hospitalist or an intensivist most of the time, one of those two, or another doctor that is assigned to that hospital. And they are the ones who are now guiding you or your family through your medical decisions. This person doesn't know you, doesn't know your values, doesn't have any long-standing relationship with you, and all of a sudden you're thrust into this type of a context. So living wills oversimplify, and they place decisions into the hands of medical care providers. Let me give you a real-world practical example from my own family, from my wife Tammy's family. Her grandmother, wonderful Christian lady, had a hemorrhagic stroke a number of years ago. She was 80 years old. They lived in Oregon at the time, which is not a good place to live as an elderly person facing those kinds of issues. Quite frankly, Oregon's one of the worst places you can live in terms of the mindset and the climate culturally. The family were told by doctors that grandma was in a deep coma, that she would never regain consciousness, and that if by some chance she did, she would never really have any cognitive reasoning abilities. She wouldn't know them. She certainly wouldn't speak again. And she had an advance directive that said that she was not to have a feeding tube. Well, Grandma started showing signs of making some progress, despite what the doctors had said. Tammy and I are here on the East Coast, and we're sweating bullets coming out of our skin because she has this advance directive, which was really based on misperceptions in the way things were framed to her when the advance directive was written, that says she can't have a feeding tube. She needs a feeding tube right now to survive. And she's showing signs of stabilizing and showing signs of progress. Again, the doctors are saying that she'll never wake up, and if she does, she won't know anyone. About 10 days out from the stroke, several of her sons were in the room. All of a sudden, she opened her eyes, sat up in bed, and said, "I'm hungry, I'd like something to eat." And lived another 12 years. Lived another 12 years. Tammy's grandparents were married for 73 years. That is a prime example to me of the issues of oversimplification with living wills and placing those decisions into the hands of someone other than your immediate family or those who you know and you trust. There's a push in hospitals to have every patient complete an advance directive when they are admitted or while they are in the hospital. The problem with that also is that typically is not a form that's just handed to a patient and they fill the form out with a family member. It will be typically a nurse, a social worker, sometimes a chaplain, and quite frankly, there are a whole lot of hospital chaplains who don't share our worldview, a lot. There are some wonderful Christian chaplains as well, but there are a lot of folks in chaplaincy who aren't where we are with these issues. And that advance directive is basically walked through step by step with the patient by this person. How that person presents things and how that person frames these issues can hugely bias in a very adverse way the decisions the patient makes, especially if no one else is around to help them process these decisions. That can hugely bias the decision they make in terms of their advance directives. The other thing is this, and this comes directly from the advance directive of a large health system in Maryland. There is a Q&A in the form, and it says this: Can a doctor override my living will? And the answer to the question is this. Usually no. However, a doctor is not required, and this very much piggybacks on what Dr. Harrison was talking about, a doctor is not required to provide a, in quotes, medically ineffective treatment even if a living will asks for it. So you've placed your care in the hands of the medical provider, the care provider, the doctor, rather than the decision-making being retained by those close to you who know you well. So that being said, a living will is generally not a good option or the best option. The second form of advance directive, which is a very good option that I want to talk about, is this. It's a durable power of attorney for health care. And I know Georgette talked about this a little bit last year at the Summit for Life. A durable power of attorney for health care is legally binding. It designates a trusted family member or a friend whom you select with the authority to make health care decisions for you if you're not able to make them for yourself. There's a wonderful durable power of attorney for health care that the Patients' Rights Council makes available on their website. If you Google Patients' Rights Council, they're based in Steubenville, Ohio, you can purchase these forms. They're relatively inexpensive. They also have them available. You can purchase them online and create and file them in a database. They call theirs the Protective Medical Decisions Document. And they are tailored specifically for the state in which you reside. So they have a specific one for Maryland. There's another one that is clustered for a number of states where the laws are similar. This document is designed to protect you and your values and retain decision-making in your hands or those who know you best. The other thing about the Patients' Rights Council durable power of attorney for healthcare is this, that the one thing that it clearly states that is binding, that it doesn't leave an option for, is that your healthcare agent does not have the authority to approve the direct and intentional ending of your life. And that is stated explicitly in the document. Now again, a durable power of attorney for healthcare is, I believe, and Anglicans for Life would say, is the best option for us because it allows for someone to make decisions in the midst of all of the complexities that arise in these types of situations. But there are some considerations when choosing a durable power of attorney for health care, and there are three I'm going to mention. First, you need to appoint someone who has the strength of character to make good judgments even when they're difficult and even in a high-pressure situation. Someone who can think the issues through from a life-affirming biblical worldview. Second, related to that, you need to appoint someone who you can trust to make biblical, life-affirming decisions. That may mean that one of your children is not the best choice for this role. It may mean, in some cases, that your spouse is not the best person for that role. And the third consideration is you need to appoint someone who lives locally and who's likely to be available to you in the distant future. Because again, advance directives are not activated, except for the last one I'm going to talk about, are not activated until the future when you can't make medical decisions for yourself. Now, one of the concerns is that there are times when people don't have someone like that in their life. It's very tragic, but that is the case. And then you've got to step back and really think through, is a living will the better way to go where I am as highly specific as possible? Again, not a good option, but sometimes people are between a rock and a hard place. The other thing to think about with a durable power of attorney for healthcare is if someone approaches you or me and asks us to serve in that role for them. And I think the question we need to ask then is this: might I be asked or be expected to make decisions that disregard biblical life-affirming views or that violate my conscience? In other words, is this person's worldview and understanding of end-of-life issues in line with my values, or are we at odds to such an extent that I really, in good conscience, can't make the kind of decisions that that person will want me to make? And if that's the case, then we need to graciously decline. Anglicans for Life has a wonderful document, which each of you received as you came in today, called Finishing Life God's Way. And it walks through all of the nuts and bolts of developing an advance directive and all of the things you need to consider. And it involves things like funeral planning. I think Georgette may talk about this even more a little bit later. Funeral planning, things you want done, your wishes, beyond medical care, but I want, if I'm in this condition, to receive this kind of care that affirms my dignity as a human being. What this doesn't have in it is a living will, and that is by design. Instead, what we are encouraging folks to do is to use this document and then attach a durable power of attorney for healthcare to this, and then that makes it a complete advance directive that is very comprehensive and covers far more than just medical decision making. And again, each of you received these. You can also download this from the Anglicans for Life website. And Anglicans for Life, I know, would be glad to provide assistance for folks walking through this if you have questions as well. The final kind of advance directive I want to talk about is something that is called a MOST, or in some states a POST document. A medical order for life-sustaining treatment or a physician's order for life-sustaining treatment. In some states, it's also called a POST document, but typically MOST or POST. This is a little bit different. It is a medical order signed by a physician. The patient does not sign it. The patient assents to it, but it is not signed by the patient. The difference with a MOST or a POST document is that it is legally binding immediately. And it deals with issues like nutrition and hydration, resuscitation, intubation, being placed on a ventilator, and those types of issues. But it is binding immediately. When I was initially preparing this presentation, I went online and did a fair amount of research on MOST and POST documents. I'm familiar with them because they're really pushed in Maryland. I'll talk about that in a moment. They were designed by intent for people in the late stages of terminal illness. AARP defines a MOST or POST document that way. Post.org defines it that way. CompassionAndSupport.org and a number of other websites all state that it is for end-of-life issues. But the way they're presented in Maryland is that patients are all approached with a MOST or a MOST document when they're admitted to the hospital. And if in the context where I serve, if I go into a patient's electronic medical record, if they've completed a POST document or a MOST document, right across the top in red letters on the EMR, it will say, do not intubate, do not resuscitate. This is intended for end of life. And these are people being admitted often for very routine matters. I interacted with a man, this was a prime example, it would have been probably last August, 48 years old, admitted to the hospital because he stepped on a nail and he needed IV antibiotic therapy for a few days to treat his cellulitis, effectively, the infection that he had in his foot. He had completed a MOST document that said, do not intubate. Why in the world, if he had a health crisis while he was in the hospital, would someone in that situation not be intubated to help them get over the hump and recover? And yet, because it said do not intubate, if he would have had a crisis, they were legally bound not to intubate that patient. A MOST or a POST document in almost all cases is a bad thing. Georgette has a horror story that she could share about her father with a MOST or a POST document in the middle of the night in an emergency room and a physician really pressing it. And again, those issues are framed in a way that the physician is presenting the questions to you. So there can be a huge bias in terms of how that is approached. The one instance where a MOST or a POST document, and Georgette may disagree with this even, might be appropriate is if you are on home hospice care, very end stages of life. If you stop breathing, if you die, someone in your family or one of your caregivers, even though you're on hospice, panics, and they call 911 and emergency medical services comes to the house, they are obligated, if there isn't this type of a document, to do everything, even though your hospice status, to do everything they can to resuscitate you. So that may be the one exception where this is appropriate. The bottom line with all of this, we need to monitor. We need to not be afraid or intimidated about asking the difficult questions. And we need to do everything that we can to retain medical decision-making in our hands or those who know and love us, who we trust. And I would conclude with that. If there are questions, I'd be glad, as time allows, to field a few questions. And again, if you have questions about hospice, which we didn't talk about, or some of the other related end-of-life issues, I will be glad to try to address them from a chaplain perspective as well.
Good. Yes, if we have any questions.
First a comment, then a question. We have a friend who's in her 20s, her early 20s. She has a chronic illness which causes a lot of hospital stays. She spent half of last year in the hospital. And shortly after coming to the summit, last year we went to see her in the hospital, and she told us a story. At the time she was 22 years old, she was in a lot of pain. They come in the middle of the night and start handing her all these documents to sign. And praise the Lord, she refused to sign them. So it was just really interesting coming from the summit and actually seeing that effect.
And that's very
that
much
was close-
Georgette's story with her father
Right, with her
as
dad,
well.
I remember that. The question I have is, I have a family member that is dealing with end of life at this point. It's a difficult conversation to bring up, and I am almost certain, when I see the way they interact with the medical community, they're doing everything the doctor is telling them to do. So I don't doubt that they've signed everything the doctor is telling them to sign. If I went to them and explained to them about a durable power of attorney, would that trump everything else they signed in the past? And the other question I have is, how do I bring that up to them? It's an awkward conversation, and I could tell by the look on your face it's really awkward. You might not have an answer.
It's a
Thank
very
you.
difficult subject to broach, particularly if the person just doesn't want to go there. But you may want to try to segue into it because obviously they're thinking about it at some level because they have this person you're talking about has advanced illness. I think so the conversation, bring it up and ask, have you thought about what you would want if, and give some scenarios. And some people are very resistant. Some people won't talk about end-of-life issues at all. They're just going to shut the conversation down, either change the subject, or in some cases just shut it down. But all you can do is try. As graciously pray and ask God to give you the right words and the right timing, because it is something we need to talk about, even though it is difficult. In terms of the durable power of attorney for healthcare, and I'm not an attorney, it should trump those other documents. The key is they need to make sure they have that. They need to make their physician aware of that. And if those records are also incorporated into their electronic medical record in a hospital or several health systems, they need to get this information to them so that can be changed. And then they need to verify that it has been changed as well, because typically in a hospital, there's a checklist in the EMR, living will, advance directive, healthcare agent, that sort of thing, and it's all done electronically. So that needs to be corrected so that there's not confusion in terms of particularly caregivers who aren't intimately acquainted with the patient. And if there are attorneys here or physicians who can speak to that better than I can, I would welcome your input as well.
Was there an attorney that wanted to speak?
No.
Okay. If I have been designated with a durable power of attorney for someone, and they're recommending extubating or refusing food, and I say, no, I have the durable power of attorney, do you see any pressure, such as Dr. Harrison, that, well, if we continue this, you will have to be paying for it? Is there any pressure from legal or insurance with that in that way?
I don't think there will be pressure directly put on you in terms of paying for it, but there is pressure put on folks who are in this decision-making role in that regard, especially with, we have limited medical resources, and as Dr. Harrison talked about, this is a poor allocation those limited resources. You get that sort of thing. Or, one of the questions that people are often told to ask, and it is a really bad question to ask a physician, is what would you do if this was your mother or your father? That's not a good question to ask, because what they would do, frankly, there are physicians who don't answer that at all in light of what they would do. They're answering based on the agenda they have and I've seen this, where they want to take, and again, I'm not denigrating the medical profession. There are many wonderful physicians, but some physicians will tailor that response to where they want to take that conversation, how they want to direct you in terms of decision making. And so that's not the type of question to ask, and that's why you have a durable power of attorney for health care. There can be tremendous pressure at times, particularly from certain physicians or certain social workers. I've been in team conferences where families get branded, but so be it. That you get branded that you're in denial. You're not in denial. Sometimes people are, but you're not in denial very often. You have a different worldview and a different value on life than these people do, and it's not just about quality of life. It's about the intrinsic God-assigned value that is part of being human. And sometimes in the secular world, the sense of that is lost, and it all boils down to allocation of resources and quality of life, as if somehow a person who has limited capacity is created less in the image of God, or less of an image bearer of God than the rest of us. And that is just patently false.
How do we deal with questions when someone's at the end of their life, and they have questions, or their families have questions about palliative care, especially with the much stronger narcotics, to keep them comfortable as they are transitioning from this life to the next?
That's a very complex area, and narcotics are at times used to hasten death, even though it's not said that they are. I would borrow from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops on that, because narcotics are valuable in terms of alleviating suffering in those last hours of life. One of the things that particularly like morphine does, and again, I'm not speaking as a doctor, but having been around a lot of patients as they died, the whole struggling to breathe when a person is actively dying, what we would call air hunger, where they're gasping for breath, morphine relieves that sense of air hunger. That being said, their air intake is also reduced. So there is a level where that hastens death. I think the ethical issue is whether the drug is being given with the intent of hastening death, or that is a secondary outcome of the therapy to alleviate their suffering, but not the intention. And that's really the position I've seen that best articulated by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, where they address that type of an issue. But we need to be very careful. We need to ask questions when that's being discussed. Again, morphine in particular is very helpful at alleviating that type of really severe respiratory distress. But at the same time, you're not getting the oxygen either. Does that?
Passing, and with the idea of them pressuring us to sign a DNR and do not resuscitate, and he had emphysema. And the way that we handled this, and this is something I don't know if it's available in this state, but what they were pressuring us with the hospice team that they originally gave us, but we didn't know that you could get a Roman Catholic. We got a Roman Catholic hospice team, and then their philosophy changed, because
Absolutely.
they were trying to force us to sign a DNR in order to send him home. So if something happened on the ambulance, they would not resuscitate him, and that wasn't what he wanted, you know. And so I think that sometimes if you can switch the hospice team based on the philosophy of the hospice team, that can be helpful. But I have a question, because this is something that's come up recently, just in terms of ministry. You know, when they make the question, to me, it seems intuitively, I know that if you don't give people fluid, if you don't give them food, they're really suffering. But to what extent do we know what the consequences of that is, because like at sometimes when people are actively dying, they don't eat, you know?
And there is a threshold, again, I'm speaking as a chaplain, not as a physician, but there is a threshold with certain advanced diseases that a person can cross where trying to give them nutrition and hydration actually does more harm than good, because it actually causes suffering because your body can't any longer process or assimilate the nutrition. But that still needs to be guarded against, because very often what it really is about is, well, this person is in a coma. I'll just use that because I don't like vegetative state. And therefore, they may even be stable, but it doesn't make sense. They wouldn't want to continue living in this way, so we need to withhold nutrition. And there's actually a move among some of the pro-euthanasia and pro-assisted suicide folks these days to move beyond not only avoiding feeding tubes, but now things have progressed, at least in their conversation, to where people who no longer can lift a spoon or fork to their mouth, particularly with advanced dementia, should not receive assistance, and that is how they're defining natural death. This is the new frontier. Patients' Rights Council has a whole set of resources on this issue, but that is the new frontier. And right now, they're talking about it with advanced dementia patients and that sort of thing. It's a very, and they shouldn't be discussing it it shouldn't be on the table with those folks. I'm not at all implying that, but the next step is quadriplegics, folks with MS or muscular dystrophy. I mean, you know, there's no end to that line of thinking once you go down that path and get away from a biblical mooring. And just real quickly about hospice, because we didn't talk about hospice today. Hospice is a good thing when it's done the way it was intended and designed by Cicely Saunders to take place. There is and this is one of the things you need to be aware of as you're selecting a hospice organization, there is a tremendous difference both between faith-based and non-faith-based hospice organizations. There's also a tremendous difference in the approach and the values between nonprofit and for-profit hospice organizations. And there are a load of studies back into the 1970s, right up until the present. I've got one right here from the Journal of the American Medical Association comparing nonprofit to for-profit hospice organizations and how they perform. And there's a whole different approach to care, obviously, in a for-profit, because the approach is you want to keep costs down. So less highly trained clinical professionals. They don't like oncology patients. They're much less likely to take oncology patients because oncology patients often require expensive drugs and a higher level of care. They prefer not to take, and this is all borne out in this study. If anyone's interested, I can show you this later. I've got the abstract with me. They're much less likely to take statistically home hospice patients. Again, it's more expensive, requires a higher level of care, personnel traveling to the home. They much prefer nursing home patients, dementia patients, and that sort of thing, where the level of care required is lower. So that's one of those things you need to ask about, you need to explore if you're faced with selecting a hospice. Okay. Thank you very much.